today. Tansei, thank you, Lee. Tansei, hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start by introducing our incredible panelists that we have joining today. So we're starting with Karl Dockstader. He is from the Oneida Bear Clan. He's one half of the award-winning duo that hosts the entertaining, engaging, and occasionally accurate radio hit One Dish, One Mic Sunday morning radio show on 610 CKTB. Karl and his co-host, Sean Vanderkils, were selected by the Canadian Journalism Foundation for the prestigious CJF CBC Indigenous Fellowship Award. Karl was recently arrested when he was covering the 1492 Land Back Lane story as a freelance journalist. Welcome, Karl. We're going to go next to Karyn Pugliese. Karyn is best known for her work as a Parliament Hill reporter and as the executive director of news and current affairs at the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network, where she ran the news department for 7 years. She joined Ryerson's faculty in the spring of 2020 while completing a Newman Fellowship at Harvard University. Karyn has worked in both daily news and on long-form investigations at a variety of outlets, including iChannel, Vision TV, CBC, and CTV. She is the past president of the Canadian Association of Journalists and currently co-chairs the Advocacy Committee. She is a board member of Canadian Journalists for Free Expression and is a Journalist for Human Rights ambassador. Welcome. Lastly, I'll introduce Peter Jacobsen. Peter is a lawyer with over 40 years experience in media law, defamation law, administrative law, and constitutional law. He is a Canadian Journalist for Free Expression board member and chair of the Canadian Issues Committee. Jacobson was appointed Ontario Chief Negotiator on several important First Nations files. Currently, he provides advice to APTN on the police treatment of reporters. He was appointed Ontario Chief Negotiator on several important First Nation files. Currently, he provides advice to APTN on the police treatment of reporters. Welcome. So good to see you all. Feel free to unmute. So today we're going to be talking about Karl Dockstader's arrest and the implications of the charges against him in regards to the future of journalism, in regards to covering, land issues in Canada, Indigenous land issues. So I'm going to give you a brief backgrounder of the Land Back Lane. So the 1784 Halamant Proclamation was a decree that guaranteed the Haudenosaunee of Six Nations a tract of land in Ontario as compensation for the alliance established with the British during the American Revolution. This granted land extended from Lake Erie all the way down to the Grand River in southwestern Ontario. But much of this promised land was stolen back immediately and was no longer under Indigenous control due to disputes over land rights with the Crown and later the Canadian government. Over 230 years later, the Haudenosaunee are fighting to protect their sovereignty over the last remaining parcel of land in Caledonia. Land defenders from Six Nations have been occupying Mackenzie Meadows, a residential development site, since July 19th in an attempt to stop construction on unceded Native land. Land defenders renamed the encampment 1492 Land Back Lane. The demonstrations were peaceful until recent violent clashes with the Ontario Provincial Police began in August. The construction contractor was granted an injunction against the land defenders and the OPP began making arrests. Numerous people have been arrested since, including Karl Dockstader. And here he is. Let's get right into it. So, Karl, let's revisit your time covering 1492 Land Back Lane. So you were camped out on site. You were there reporting with One Dish, One Mic, and you were behind the barricades. What was that like?
Yeah, so the time that I was there, they actually had just taken down the barricades from the first reaction after the police interaction. But I worked it out in the course of talking to other media. I'd been to the site on about 15 different occasions. A lot of it was collecting material for our Sunday morning radio show that's Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. on AM 610 CKTV. A lot of it was collecting information for that. We'd done a freelance piece with Canada Land by the point that I'd been down there, but mostly there wasn't much media coverage. It was pretty quiet on the media front. CBC Indigenous, I think, did their first or second piece while I was there on site. APTN had just started to do daily updates while I was there, and other media outlets, without naming names of potential future colleagues or employers or whatever, they were just there for the fires and for the blockades and the blustery stuff. So I made the decision to go, and I had actually I had you on the show the Sunday before I went, Brandi, and we talked about it. So I talked to you about precautions and things to do, and I didn't so I went anyways, and the whole point of going was that I've been watching these things unfold in the news my entire life. My point of awareness of sort of news was when I was 10 years old. The Oka siege happened. The siege of Kahnawake and Kanesatake territory happened. That shaped my worldview as a 10-year-old kid, seeing these warriors and lasagna and everybody portrayed as these like rebel badasses or whatever. And I just saw things happening here in Haudenosaunee territory, and I had a pretty good idea of where these narratives could go. So I went, and in earnest, as an Oneida person, which is one of the member nations of the Haudenosaunee, but still a bit of an outsider to Six Nations itself, to go and to tell the story. So I made the decision to spend the whole week, and I grabbed a tent and I embedded myself with the camp and started to tell stories from the second I hit the ground.
And were you wearing any media identification at the time? Did you let police know ahead of time that you were going there to report?
So I didn't. And again, I'm really glad you're hosting this panel, because we spoke like the Sunday, and then I packed my car right after you were on our show, and I went out there, and I'm pretty sure that was some of the guidance that you had offered, like about labeling my car. Like I took my car, which stayed on the site for the week, labeling that with press information. But I did. I mean, I talked to our program director at 610 CKTV, and I talked to you, and I talked to other people about taking precautions. I had a stack of these cards. On the Tuesday of the week, I actually got, this is I guess it's hard to see because of the lighting, but I actually got the head of the OPP's contact information when I had an interaction with the police on the Tuesday. So I clearly identified myself as press, like early on in my engagement there. Was I wearing a badge? No. Did I label my car? No. I now know they were using license plates. They are still using license plates to track people that are coming and going from the site. So did I take every precaution possible? No. Did I think I covered my bases though? And that I was being fair and earnest in my approach as a journalist? I really thought I did cover my bases.
So you were charged with mischief and failing to comply with the court order, possibly stemming from a video that you posted on social media, playing a lacrosse game with some of the land defenders. What was it like? So your arrest was kind of uneventful. It wasn't, dramatic. You were called in, you went down to the station, but that it still must have been quite shocking to be arrested.
Yeah, I didn't believe it. Like I still don't believe it. I still think this is an oversight or a mistake or that once this evidence goes through the process, like I know courts are taking forever because of COVID, and that's nobody's fault. But I hope it was an oversight. I mean, visually, but there's two things. Visually, I was close to the land defenders on all occasions. If I was interviewing Skylar and he was unloading tools from the back of a vehicle or whatever, I'm not sure in the course of a conversation what I did. I know I took out garbages, for example, and I know that right. I took out garbages and I was eating with everyone. I sang songs which I wrote about in my piece after the fact. I played lacrosse. I mean, I was embedded. But I have to throw this out there that for me that was an important part of the storytelling. I wasn't there just to parachute in, extract a story from these people, and then go back and sell it for the big money that journalists make. or whatever happens. That wasn't my goal. The idea is that I wanted to tell this story from a journalistic vantage point in a different way. But yeah, was it the lacrosse? Was it the taking out the garbage? Was it the fact that I camped there? Like I don't know, but I know I don't want the OPP to be deciding that.
Exactly. So Karyn, were you surprised when you learned that Karl was arrested? What was your reaction?
I was outraged. I mean, we've been through this before, and time and again. Karl had mentioned the Kanesatake resistance in 1990. That was huge for me too. I'm a little bit older than Karl. So I was already at the end of high school and had decided to go into journalism. And shortly after Kanesatake, there was the 1995 Gustafson Lake Ipperwash crisis where Dudley George was killed. So through these events, and at the difference that I saw, I was midway through a journalism degree and deciding to shift to history. I liked journalism, but I saw what journalism was doing to my people. Journalists had stayed away from Gustafson Lake. They'd stayed away from Ipperwash. They were misreporting facts. They kept reporting that Dudley George had a gun when he didn't have a gun. And I was embarrassed to go back to my community and tell them that I was going to graduate from journalism. So I was switching over to history. And then Alanis Abomswin came out with her documentary on the Kanesatake resistance, 270 years of resistance. And I could see for the first time that there was a path through media for our people, because there was none before. I mean, APTN didn't exist. You had maybe some small local papers, but our issues weren't being covered and weren't being covered well. And here was a woman who went and did what Karl did and embedded with a group of people and was able to show the other side of the barricade and show the world from our point of view as Indigenous people, which we had not seen before. There were reporters who were working for mainstream media who were trying, but they still have to face with editors, producers who switch that point of view back to a mainstream lens. So when Karl gets arrested, I mean, the first person to get arrested on this was Justin Bragg. And I know, Justin, you're out there watching.
And we're getting to him soon.
Yeah, he went through a couple of years of hell. I know we're going to get to him more, but he went through a couple of years of hell, and there's been subsequent arrests since. And they all seem to be these test cases involving Indigenous stories, Indigenous land actions particularly. So this was outrageous. This is outrageous when we have the constitutional right. We've always had the right. We've gone back to court and proved we have the right to be there and to tell these stories and to bear witness.
Thank you. So, Peter, I just want to talk briefly about how, in your articling career, like at the beginning of your career, you wrote a case comment about this conflict happening in Six Nations. Can you talk about that briefly? It's been a dispute that's been going on for a long time. And would it have held up the case that you had worked on? Would it have held up in 2020?
Well, let me just explain a little bit about the background, and also to admit that although Karyn may feel that she's older than Karl, I'm definitely older than both of everybody here. Because this all happened when I was when I was at my last year of university. I wrote this article called Who Rules the Valley of the Six Nations? And it all had to do with a critique of the Ontario Court of Appeal case where the Six Nations hereditary chiefs came forward and said, look, when you read the Halamant Proclamation, which recorded what the British said that they would do for the Six Nations, if they fought on behalf of the British in the War of 1812, which they did. They were incredibly brave. They did a terrific job. And when it came, they got the Halamant. When you read the proclamation, in my view, and in the view of many people, it clearly says that the Six Nations should get the fee simple in the land. That means that they get to own the land just like everyone else owns their land. They can sell it, they can rent it, they can build on it, they can do whatever they want. Instead, what the British did was they gave them what we called the usufructory right, which means just the right to use the land, not to be able to sell it, not be able to rent it, etc. So the British interpretation of the proclamation, and later the Canadian interpretation, was that the hereditary chiefs would only get, and by the way, if the hereditary chiefs were right, then the Six Nations would not be under the Indian Act, in which case the elected chiefs would not have authority. And it's interesting to see that all these years later, the dispute still remains between the hereditary chiefs and the elected band council. So it all came down to the wording of the proclamation, or so we thought. But when we got to the Supreme Court of Canada, they said, no, the fact that the band had received monies that would be given to it under the Indian Act was enough to bring it under the Indian Act, and therefore the hereditary chiefs lost. On your question of whether that would be decided the same way today, I think it's quite possible. I'm not saying it's a slam dunk. Lawyers don't do that, but I do think that it's possible. I do think that the Six Nations definitely did not get what they were promised by the British through the Halamant Proclamation.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, I wanted to talk about the Justin Brake case. So people who are unfamiliar, so Brake was arrested after he entered the Muskrat Falls site along with people who were protesting possible methylmercury contamination in the food chain once the land was flooded for a reservoir. The occupation lasted several days and work at the site was halted. In October 2016, he was covering this Muskrat Falls story for The Independent. Indigenous land and water protectors broke a lock and entered the property of Nalcor Energy. Brake followed the protesters, filming and documenting what happened to them over the course of several days. He was the sole reporter inside the property, inside the facility. When Nalcor filed and was granted an injunction to get the demonstrators off the property, they listed Brake on the injunction without mentioning that he was a journalist and not part of the protest. Brake was charged criminally with mischief and disobeying a court order and with civil contempt proceedings in Newfoundland and Labrador Supreme Court because he'd been present on the property. Since then, as of 2020, Brake has beaten all the charges against him. How did this set the precedent for journalists reporting on contentious Indigenous stories in Canada? So I'm going to ask you, Peter, and then I'm going to go to Karyn on this.
Okay, well, quite clearly the Court of Appeal of Newfoundland and Labrador, I think was most succinct. It's a Court of Appeal decision. I think it's very, very important. And to my mind, what Justin did was create a precedent that should be extremely persuasive in other courts. When they went and got this interlocutory ex parte injunction, their duty, the people getting it, is to make full disclosure to the court, and they did not disclose that Justin was there as a reporter.
Yeah.
So that was one of the main reasons for overturning it. But I'm just going to read this, and I'm sorry for reading, but I think it's really important, and I hope that people just bear with me for a moment, because what the Court of Appeal said: a court decision that does not recognize journalists as independent observers and reporters of events, but instead places them on the same footing as participants, imperils journalists' required independence and will inhibit them from embedding with protesters during conflicts. Okay, that's the general principle with respect to journalists. Then they got down, and the court referred specifically to the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the court stated, to achieve the goal of reconciliation, better understanding of Aboriginal peoples and Aboriginal issues is needed. This places a heightened importance on ensuring that independently reported information about Aboriginal issues, including Aboriginal protests, is available to the extent possible. And this is what's important. Accordingly, when a journalist is covering Aboriginal protests, his or her role should be a material fact disclosed and considered when an applicant seeks an ex parte order that may reasonably have the effect of interfering or unnecessarily restricting the journalist's coverage. In other words, what the Court of Appeal is saying is that not only is it important that journalists be seen as being different from participants, but it's even more important that the Aboriginal journalists get this understanding, because it is one way of furthering reconciliation with First Nations. I think it's an incredibly good decision. I am dismayed that in some cases judges have not referred to it, even though it's been put before them. But nevertheless, in those cases, the journalist has been let off, which is what I expect is going to happen with Karl, but who knows?
So, Karyn, how is Brake's case precedent for journalists facing arrest on the job? We know that as Indigenous journalists, this is a normality, right? In our reporting, we're reporting on these kind of contentious events almost all the time. You yourself, your first story was on a blockade. I know you followed Brake's case very closely, and APTN actually came and intervened. Is that correct? What's your
So I'll go to a few things. Yes, my very first story that I filed for APTN was on a blockade, and Karl can just kind of go ping whenever something sounds familiar. So this was an Algonquin community. I'm Algonquin, but it wasn't my community. It was a community that was split over a resource issue, where the chief and den council had signed an agreement that a majority of the people, or a group of the people, didn't agree with. So they blocked the road and kept the resources from going in. So while I was covering that, I was able to freely move back and forth, exactly like Annalisa Baum-Swin and every other journalist in the history of journalism who decided to go out and cover these events has done. I was not arrested. The police did not even try to stop me. So when the Justin Brake comes along, the lower court had made a decision that at first, Peter's right, they had not been informed that Justin was a journalist. It went back to the same judge to review, and he said, well, that isn't even a material fact because journalists have no special rights. And that was the point where I became an intervener in the case, because I could see that the work that we did every single day in an APTN was now at risk, and that a right that we've always had as journalists was at risk, not because of Justin Brake, and I think I misspoke earlier and said Justin Brake was arrested. He was charged but never arrested, which is an important point for him. So when I intervened in that case, we did raise the issue of reconciliation, and I was really glad that the court heard that. We did raise the specter of what had happened in Ipperwash and Gustafson Lake, and what happens when journalists are not there to bear witness to police actions as they move in on these events, and the kind of human rights abuses that can happen. Yeah. So this is all very important. And I would say that the decision really did what Peter said, is it said it is important for journalists to be at these events, but especially when it's the state versus Indigenous people. It's important for any journalist, Aboriginal journalists for sure, but any journalist to be able to be present.
Particularly when it relates to land issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, can we talk about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how this might play in, Peter?
Well, I understand that what that is it's basically a framework. So when governments adopt it, and it would have been, I think it would have been adopted by the federal government, but it died on the order paper. The BC government has adopted it. Nothing's moved forward on it, but basically what it does is it says, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to incorporate a number of principles into our legislation to the best of our ability. It is not like the be all and end all. It's the beginning. It's the beginning of getting provinces to recognize that they need to make amendments to their legislation here and there. And what they do is going to be up to them, but at least it's the start of putting some of these principles into law so they can be used as a way of saying to a judge, look, this is the law, as opposed to this is a principle that we think you should look at, or this is a guideline that you might want to adopt. Once it gets put into law, it'll have a lot more effect. But as I say, it's early days, but it is a useful document.
So Karyn, how would UNDRIP apply for, the media and having, rights as Indigenous peoples to cover, our stories the way that we want to define them?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting is UNDRIP talks about Indigenous rights to culture. It also talks about a right to media. And so in the media that I've worked in, including APTN, it's very much a Western model of journalism. But there are things that we adapted and we decided we were going to do differently. And the telling of stories, we put Indigenous people at the center of the stories. We take their point of view. But there's other things also that happen out when we're covering stories because we are Indigenous people. So, for example, when I was out at Coquimville, I participated in ceremonies because you know what? These are Algonquin people who grew up out in the bush and everything is sacred. The rocks are sacred, the trees are sacred, you are sacred, I am sacred. Everything is ceremony, eating is ceremony. And so it's this thing where I can still be a journalist and I can still be Indigenous at the same time. And my worry, if this case was to go forward and not get thrown out, and the police get to decide what journalists can and can't do, what constitutes an act of journalism and what doesn't. If we're going to have the courts mucking in that, they're starting to muck in who we are as Indigenous people, as well as who we are as journalists.
Yes, thank you. So, Karl, I wanted to talk about cultural protocols on the job as a reporter. So, I mean, how do we know when to draw the line? How do you draw the line? Sometimes even I smudge at events, I take part in feasts. This work that we're doing is about building relationships because there's a lot of damage between the media and our communities. What are your thoughts on this and the protocols on the job?
Yeah, that's what's key. I think you hit the nail on the head on a lot of issues. But what was key for the approach that I used, and what I think will be key for Indigenous journalism moving forward, is that we have journalists that are sensitive to the history and the negative impact that journalism has had. Like I grew up split all over cities, Buffalo, London, Toronto, like all over the place, but London in particular. Like I remember the criminalization of Indigenous people and of Black people and of people of color in the media, and the inflammatory pictures and the way that stories are told. And so if we're going to tell these stories in a fair way moving forward, then I think we need to be mindful of the fact that in many ways, objective media has actually been a tool that's caused harm, which doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a standard and that the line between activism and journalism should be blurred or anything like that. But to be clear, like I'm never not Ungwehonwe. I'm never not Anyata'aga. I'm never not a Wali Niwaga Telota. Like I don't put my clan aside before I go in. So and I think that actually enhances the storytelling. I think that it enhances the public's access to information.
Yes.
There are people who decided what happened at Lamback Lane on either side long before I ever set up my my camera phone and did a live webcast or radio broadcast or a written piece. There are people that decided that, but what I'm there for is for the people that want to know more and want to understand that context. And we as Indigenous journalists need to contextualize the stories around our indigeneity, not separate from it.
That's powerful. Thank you. So, Peter, can the police decide what a journalist can and can't do on the job?
The answer is that the police have an enormous discretionary power. We see that not only with Indigenous people, but also with regular people, with kids who are walking down the street and have dreadlocks, and they're more likely to be stopped and questioned and harassed. So yes, they have enormous discretionary power. The other side of it is, should they be able to, is another question. And my answer to that is no, they should not be able to. I think that the line has to be drawn very, very far away from what Karl did. As long as the reporter is not interfering with what the police are trying to do. For example, let's suppose the police were trying to forcibly evict people. If a reporter goes in there and tries to push the police away, then the reporter is going to be charged, and we've got to see that as probably where the line would be. But the real problem here is on the one hand, maintaining the rights of Indigenous reporters, and on the other hand, being a little bit practical, because you don't want to be getting thrown out all the time. You don't want to be getting arrested. So that's the trade-off that has to be made. In the same way that let's use the example of the kid with the dreadlocks. He can speak to when the police stop him. He can tell them to FO, or he can say, "Yes, officer, what is it that you want?" Now, one is going to get him a lot further than the other. That's what I'm trying to say here. I'm not suggesting that you bend over and you agree with what the police are doing, but you have to, if you are going to be hostile to the police or rude to them, you've got to recognize that that's more likely to get you arrested.
I don't think that any journalists that have been arrested that I know of recently here in Canada in regards to covering Indigenous, land defense have been, rude or, acting that way before getting arrested or even, bringing attention to themselves.
No, I wasn't suggesting they were. I was just trying to say where you asked me about discretionary power and how it gets meted out. And obviously you get further with honey than with vinegar in these situations.
So although I will say that with some of the journalists that have been, harassed, arrested, threatened with arrest with police, we saw a lot of this up at Wet'suwet'en and Wet'suwet'en, thank you, got tongue-tied. And also at the Alton gas protests. So when I was at APTN, I had 2 reporters stopped by RCMP at so-called exclusion zones that were trying to keep them several miles away from filming arrests. Allegedly for their safety. And I'm using air quotes because they were arresting some clan mothers. I mean, there was no danger. They just didn't want the arrests filmed is really what I think was going on. And then at Wet'suwet'en, you had Melissa Cox eventually arrested. That whole thing is on camera. She is doing nothing but filming when they take her down. You had Jesse Winter and Bunker Seyfarth, who were together filming, and the police kept telling them to move back, to move out of the way. And the only thing was that Jesse kept saying, are you going to arrest me? Or are you saying you're going to arrest a journalist? And eventually they detained them, put them in the back of the car and drove them away so that they couldn't film and they couldn't report. Who else was threatened there? These were the cases that were happening time and again. There was Jerome Turner. Also.
Yeah, he had guns put in his face.
He had guns put in his face. He was detained. They moved him. They said that he could stay, but they moved him into a spot where he would have no cell phone action and he wouldn't be able to see anything. So, I mean, it's clear to me that in some of these cases, it's simply the police not wanting arrests or police actions filmed. And I'm not saying that's because the police are, sometimes I actually feel sorry for the cops because I imagine a lot of them decided to become police officers because they probably thought they were going to be helping people, not being used as a blunt instrument to enforce injunctions when the government decides to take 100 years to solve a land claim. So I think it's probably a little embarrassing for them and maybe they don't want to be put on film, but they still don't have the right to interfere with journalists.
Peter, so does the state or police, do they have a responsibility also to protect journalists? And how do they put that into practice?
Yes, I think they have a responsibility to protect all citizens, to serve and protect all citizens. That is their job. Now, how they exercise it is a totally different question, but the answer to your question is absolutely they have a duty to do that.
I have an audience comment from Sonia Fatah. Actually, no, this one is actually from Peter. It's for Peter. She says, I do think racial bias plays a strong role. Things that are not viewed as hostile when settlers do are viewed as hostile when Indigenous folks do them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that there have been many suggestions saying that the police should get to more sensitivity training, more cultural training in these matters. It's the kind of thing that I think Karyn was referring to, and Karl as well. I think that the fact that there is, I mean, there's racism in our society. There's going to be racism amongst police. As Karyn says, there's going to be some police officers that are good, some that aren't. But is racism a problem in this? Absolutely. I mean, I would suspect that if instead of Karl, it had been a white Globe and Mail reporter, what happened probably would not have happened. Probably the Globe and Mail reporter would not have been charged.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that brings in the issue of, smaller independent news outlets often being targeted and not having the resources behind them to defend themselves. Karyn, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, in almost all these cases, it has been smaller media that's been targeted. I know, and Peter's the lawyer for APTN now. Cheryl McKenzie is now running the place, and Cheryl's a badass. So you're not going to mess with an APTN reporter on these issues, because they will spend every last dime they have going to court and defending freedom. They've proved that. But in the case of Justin Bragg, he was so lucky he got a pro bono lawyer. In the case of Melissa Cox, I called over to CJFE, where Peter and Phil Tooney is the president of CJFE, and I said, do you have a lawyer? Do you have somebody you could recommend who could pro bono defend her, because she's not going to be able to afford a lawyer? And they came up with a name. So we've got this little network going on where when a journalist gets arrested, we assess whether or not they're going to be able to defend ourselves, and we go scrambling around for some hero lawyer that's going to take on the case pro bono. I mean, in Jeff's case, this was a 3-year commitment. Wow. And he's a boutique lawyer out in the East Coast, not part of a large firm in Toronto. So that's a hit for him. I mean, for Karl, here's somebody again who's a fledgling journalist starting up his own media, and this is who they arrest.
Karl, what's your experience been with the support and legal defense?
I've been very fortunate. Emily Lamb, part of Kastner Lamb, Danny Kastner and Emily Lamb's law firm, stepped forward, and she agreed before we talked about any kind of terms that she was going to help me see this through, and that's so important. I was a court worker in a past life, so I've had plenty of interaction with police and lawyers in particular, and I'm not going to name names, but I've seen lawyers take people to the cleaners and back, and not necessarily deliver on that. So I was clear early in the process, like, listen, I have no money in this situation, and my counsel said, what happened was wrong, and that's the important thing here, is what happened was wrong, and I need to help establish that. So don't worry about, I'm not going to take your house, I think were exact words. Wow. Further to that, I've been very fortunate, because my show again, that's Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. on AM 610 CKTV, part of the Bell Media Network. It's only 2 hours though. Like, I'm not, I'm not up. There's a huge hierarchy way above where one mic fits in there. But Bell Media stood behind me as well, and has offered full support. They said, as a matter of fact, I won't name names of who exactly said it, but what they said is that the summer of racial reckoning and acknowledging the mistakes that we've made in the past around not representing Indigenous perspectives, Black perspectives, and perspectives from people of color, that all that is just talk if we don't stand behind someone that's in your situation right now. And I took that to heart. I also realized I'm lucky, because I don't know if 6 months ago, or definitely 6 years ago, if I would have had that same level of support, because I'm just a little guy here. Either way, I mean, I would have fought this, like I said in our pre-meeting, like I would have self-represented, because that wouldn't have went well, but I still would have done it, because it's a matter of principle. The cops do not get to decide what is and isn't journalism, period. That's all. It's not up to the police.
But on that point, it's so important not to self-represent. I saw Peter's look of horror, not because I don't think that you're smart and everything, Karl, but I mean, my God, none of us want to go in and have the burden of the rights of all journalists in Canada line on the fact that you've got a layman going in and defending themselves. It's so important to have a strong legal defense.
And in that respect, I mean, Karyn's a member of many organizations, but the Canadian Association of Journalists, the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. I mean, if a journalist has got a problem and they get in touch with us, we do our very best to get them a pro bono lawyer or to get them some funding or whatever is going to result in them not having to represent themselves on their own in court, which, by the way, is something that the courts want. The courts do not want self-representative people coming in on this kind of case. They want to have good counsel making the best arguments on behalf of the Aboriginal person. And I think that's, I don't think that we've had a real problem with people having to self-represent so far. I may be wrong, but I haven't seen a case, and certainly getting in touch with either of those organizations is the way to go.
There was the one case. There was David Richie, who was arrested along with Jeremy Cohn. He hadn't done anything that I can see wrong. They were covering actually a traffic accident. Jeremy Cohn lawyered up. He worked for Global, and so they dropped the charges against him. David Richie had no lawyer to defend him, went in and pled to the charges and did community service.
Right, and he did that without trying to get our advice. We were at that point representing Cohen, who was his friend.
Yeah.
He kind of went off on his own. That's why I'm making the pitch now that if there's anyone out there that gets in this situation, before you go and do anything like plead or accept the police's version of events, get in touch with either myself or Karyn, and we'll try and get you some help, and we very likely will be able to get you some help.
Every reporter that we've helped actually has pushed the case forward. They've either gotten it off. With Melissa Cox, it was thrown out of court. With Jeremy Cohn, I didn't get involved in his case until it was already well underway, but I know CJFE was involved early on.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, Karl, so your bail conditions have been lifted. You're allowed to report back at 1492 Landback Lane. What's it like for you? Have you gone back? Are the police surveilling you when you're there?
It's hard to say if the police are surveilling me, because it's in between the time when I was arrested and now, Caledonia, like there may literally be a police officer on every corner. Like it's a smaller town, and especially in the urban area that surrounds 1492 Landback Lane, it's impossible to know what they are and aren't surveilling, because it seems like they're watching everything. For me, the feeling was amazing. Like I really didn't want to be in the middle of this story. I really did back into this type of a presentation and being in the, I suppose, I mean, reporters and journalists and media people dream of the day they can be in the New York Times, but not this way. This wasn't the way that I wanted it. So in addition to the police telling me I couldn't go there, which was just absurd, that they would give me a condition that I can't go back there, and just a poor reflection of the Canadian criminal court system. As strongly as I felt about that was about as satisfying as it felt when I went back there the day of the court ruling, to go and to again completely immerse myself in the story, to spend time with people from Six Nations, listening to the judge's ruling. Unfortunately, that was also the day that the roads were shut down again, and that was a tough time for the people of Six Nations, the people of Caledonia. But I also, this story, it's tough because we're supposed to be objective as media people, but I'm attached to this story, and but not just to the land defenders. I talk to people from Caledonia too, and I'm invested in their outcome, and I see myself again as somebody that had an opportunity to go in and to tell this story so that people can have this information, do what they want with the bits of information that I give to them. So it was devastating when I was told I couldn't go. It was almost as satisfying to finally be able to go back and just to turn the camera on and to take the notes and take pictures and document everything, because that's the way that it should be. That's the way it was meant to be, especially for this story that this is going to go on. You know, some iteration of this story is going to go on until Canada and Indigenous people actually establish some actual terms of friendship. So, but no, I was glad to be back.
Thank you. So before we go on and talk a little bit about some possible, solutions, we have a couple of questions from our viewers. So Karyn or Peter or Karl, they're looking for a few principles that media, leaders, journalists should use to cover land defense situations. What are a few tips that they could take with them when they're going into these situations?
Right. Well, there's the practical ones. Clearly, have a lawyer on call. Be careful, because I gave this advice to Brandi. Bring a gas mask. My God, I sent reporters down to Standing Rock, and I was so worried about them getting arrested. I forgot to send gas masks down with them. And of course, there was pepper spray and gas being used all over the place there, and water being sprayed on people. Bring snacks. Be prepared to probably stay overnight. You will get caught. I got caught. The reason that I camped out at Coquimville and other places is often because you end up not being able to leave because you don't know when the police are going to move in. So you go there thinking you're going to stay 30 minutes, you end up staying 4 days. And then there's the storytelling ones. You're telling a story with a point of view, and don't false balance. I find that the biggest problem, Karl's mentioning objectivity. Objectivity is a process. It's not a state of mind. We're all implicitly biased. I am a Algonquin woman. I do not apologize for it. I always reported the news like an Algonquin woman. But that doesn't mean that I won't be fair and I won't be balanced, but I also won't false balance. I won't pretend that a land claim isn't real. I won't use things like Indigenous people claim this land was theirs. The land was stolen. If there's a comprehensive land claim, there's no need to couch the words or use scare quotes. So remember that when you're walking in, that you don't have to do that. Get away from that false balance that the mainstream news does.
But what about, say, going to events now? For me, there's been instances where sometimes I will, advise let authorities know, police know that I'm going to be there. And there's been other situations where I haven't done that because I feel like they could impede my storytelling. What do you advise in those situations? Should a reporter let them know? Should they wear their identification at all times? How do we navigate that?
I always personally told my reporters to identify themselves. But honestly, we're in television, we're walking around with cameras this big. So it's not like you're going to hide it anyway. I don't know if Peter, if you wanted to add some legal advice to that.
Well, we've talked in the past about trying to establish some kind of protocol with the police to determine what it is that they would help them to be fair. I think that's a useful conversation to have. But clearly in a case where they know, as in Karl's case, they know that he's a reporter. I don't think that the fact that he isn't wearing something across his chest saying press should make a difference to them. The whole point here is to make sure that the police know that you're on the land in that capacity. If the police already know it, I don't think you should have to go ahead. However, if you're going before the court and you're trying to make the case that you should not have been treated this way or whatever, the more evidence you can put forward, such as I was wearing identification, so they clearly knew, is going to be helpful. But I understand what Brandi is saying. It also could make you a bit of a target. So it's really a judgment call in each case. What I can say is that the Newfoundland and Labrador Court of Appeal did set out a few criteria that it thought were important. And one is that he or she is not actively assisting, participating, or advocating for the protesters about whom the reports are being made. In other words, the person is there to be objective. Having said that, we see an awful lot in the media that doesn't meet that criteria, and reporters are still allowed to be there. and that you take no act that could reasonably be considered as aiding or abetting the protesters in their protest or in breaching an order. And you can't be obstructing or interfering. Well, I haven't seen any cases right now where that's been credibly alleged against Indigenous reporters. So I think that on the whole, we do that. That is done, but I do think it would be useful in every situation to try and to get some kind of protocol going with the police and to get the police. I mean, the more the police know about what we are or what we're intending to do, in terms of who's going to be there, et cetera, the harder it is for them to say, oh, we didn't know, that's why we arrested him.
Yeah. Now, what about the break decision? Is it true APTN reporters walk around with copies of that nowadays?
Yeah, I was told that that's what they had decided to do. I think that it's a nice symbolic gesture, but you know, I don't think that you can expect the police to go back and get in their squad car and sit there and pore over the decision. I don't think that's going to happen. I think where the break case is going to be useful is in establishing a protocol where people have a chance to sit down and talk, probably over Zoom, but maybe around a table, and say, look, here are the principles. So this is why we think, police, you should be acting this way and that way. That's the way to do it. I just don't think they're going to read the case. I really don't.
I think the APTN reporters are doing it more because they're cheeky badass people.
That's right. It's symbolic.
Yeah.
So what's at stake for you, Karl, if you're convicted of these charges?
Well, I think it sends a terrible message to like what can't get lost in this is that One Dish One Mic is independent Indigenous media, and it's that way by design. And while 610 CKTB is partnering with us, Canada Land, other outlets in the future, I imagine we have to maintain our independent Indigenous status first, because we're independent and Indigenous before we're media. So if this sticks, I mean, this really is going to send a chill throughout other people that are trying to do storytelling in this way. I need to throw out just real quick. I mean, I never really set out to be Indigenous media. There was a vacuum in our territory. There weren't people that were telling a lot of the stories that were happening. There's not a huge, there's great Indigenous media out there. Media Indigena, the Guguguis is doing a great job out east. Maureen Gugu, there's great independent Indigenous media that's out there, but there's still not nearly enough. And so if this sticks, I mean, this could be the death knell for other independent Indigenous media people that started out, with I don't know more, like on the street and grassroots level, like myself, where again, that was super one-sided when that storytelling happened. And that's why Indigenous people, we use the power that we had to get our stories out. And that's really the origin story of One Dish, One Mic, of what I think the future for Indigenous media is that we know there are some stakes at play. And if Indigenous media isn't allowed editorial freedom, the discretion that I used again to play lacrosse or sing a song, heaven help me, if that's considered helping the land defenders, then we've got a lot more trouble than just my conviction and charges.
And beyond what Karl says about Indigenous media, just media in general, we've seen a shyness. Justin Brake was quite alone through this case. And I imagine Karl's having some of the same dark moments that Justin did, because you can have faith the right thing will happen, but they have kids, and they're facing jail time. There are dark moments that happen where you lie there awake in bed, I'm sure, and just think, what the hell? I'm going to have a criminal record. What the hell? I was being a journalist. So it puts a chill on other people. And like I said, Brake was alone. APTN was the only intervener in that case. We went and knocked on the doors of other media, big and small, and they all had their excuses for not intervening in that case. So when we look at what happened at Wet'suwet'en, and we saw some of the smaller media like the Narwhal, Ricochet, Vice, I guess Vice is a bit bigger, but the Tyee, They were the ones that were pushing and saying, we have the right to be here. And we still didn't see the mainstream moving in that much. So now that we see a mainstream media stepping up and saying, we're going to defend Karl, that's great. I mean, that is a huge push forward. So it's keeping the momentum going and not losing that space. We had the right to do this. We always had the right to do this. The courts recognize that we have the right to be there, and we can't let them roll that back.
Karyn, what will this mean if he's convicted and if he's let off?
Well, hopefully they will throw it out, and that will be the end of it. And I'll work with Peter, and we'll start approaching police and saying, listen, you're never going to win one of these cases. So let's talk about what you need, and let's talk about some best practices that we can recommend for journalists. That is the best way forward. I don't even want to think of Karl losing the case. If he loses this case, well, we'll intervene in his case, and we'll see him through up to the Supreme Court. But ultimately, they're going to make the right decision. Look, there's a legal precedent there, and there's a constitutional right there. The right thing is going to happen.
I agree.
Peter.
I mean, if it doesn't happen at the trial level, and I expect that it will, frankly, but I think that I have a lot of faith in the approach that our Ontario Court of Appeal has taken. And I don't want to be repetitive, but when you look at the Court of Appeal decision out of Newfoundland and Labrador, it says, it basically says, accordingly, where a journalist is covering Aboriginal protests, his or her role should be a matter of fact and is very, very important. There's heightened importance on ensuring that independently reported information about Aboriginal issues, including protests, is available to the extent possible. I mean, the wording in this basically says, we recognize the need for Aboriginal reporting. We recognize that it's important to reconciliation, and therefore it is something that we are going to encourage, not discourage. And I would be very surprised if an Ontario court wouldn't take that very logical and sensible approach to heart, particularly since it's in a Court of Appeal judgment, which always means more to lawyers and judges.
And can we just take a second? I'll just jump in quickly. Let's take a second at what happened with Brake and why this is important to the public interest, because it's not about us. I mean, it's not about me, and it's not really about Karl, right? It's about serving the public interest.
Right.
So there was a group of land protectors that broke a lock and went on to Nalcor property. Nalcor sent out a tweet, oh my God, we're worried about the safety of our workers. People are going in, Justin Brake goes in with them. The police were shutting down highways. They were gearing up in riot gear. We know this is the elevation and they're getting ready to move in and they don't know how much force to move in. Now, it's not our job as a reporter to inform police, but Brake starts sending out a Facebook Live and he's showing that everything's peaceful inside. No workers are in danger. Nobody's going to get hurt. The workers were sharing food with the people who went in. There was no need for heavily armed police action, and everything calmed right down. Isn't that how, isn't that what we want? Isn't that even what police would want?
So what are the solutions, Peter? What can be done to?
So I'll try and solve like 500 years of problems right now. Here it is. I mean, I think
I have faith in you, Peter.
Pardon me?
I have faith in you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think that the protocol approach that Karyn has discussed and I've discussed is the way to go because it's more practical. I mean, yes, we can win these cases years from now in the Supreme Court of Canada, perhaps, but we still need to get some kind of buy-in and greater sensitivity and understanding on behalf of those who are being asked to enforce these orders. And I think that we have seen at least some movement in that direction with some police who are saying, no, we're not going to go in there heavily armed. We're not going to do that. I mean, we're going to be we're going to be more careful because of what's happened in the past. I don't think any government wants the political embarrassment of a major dispute, particularly when they've got the Dudley George example
But
to
they already
worry.
have the Wet'suwet'en crisis going on. That's pretty embarrassing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that they aren't going to do it. I'm just saying that they probably would prefer not to, and that gives us a good reason to try and engage in this protocol. And to echo what Karyn said earlier, don't go in on your own. Get help. There is help. There is likely, I can't promise every case, but there is likely going to be help out there if you get a hold of either the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression or the Canadian or Karyn's organization or any of us individually. We know who to link up with. So I think those are the two answers that I would put forward.
Can I just ask you, Peter? You say, to go approach the police with, maybe doing some cultural training and different protocols and stuff. But say for freelancers, like, would the people do it, like a journalist do it individually? Would it be done by the state? Would it be done corporately? How would that play out?
I think it would properly be done through the various organizations. I mean, I would see some kind of consortium that could be put together of like-minded organizations, journalists. Let me just use the phrase generally: journalist free expression organizations, Aboriginal organizations that want to move things forward. I think a consortium is going to be a lot more listened to than an individual. And I think that we would want to try and start to go pretty high up the food chain with the Solicitor General's office in order to get this going so that they will take it seriously. Because I don't think that the police on the ground, frankly, would have the time to do it unless somebody senior to them upstairs is saying, you need to meet with these people. We need to get a protocol established.
Karyn, any comment?
Well, just in support of what Peter's talking about, the CAJ is going to be forming an Indigenous subcommittee or advisory committee. We're putting a motion forward. We're just looking at our structure now because we want to be able to advise on these cases and work with CJFE. We actually had a joint meeting about this, about how we are going to reach out to police forces and try to get them on board. Try to get them to understand our needs and to get access.
Wow.
And not set up exclusion zones, not keep reporters too far away so that we can't see what's going on, and to sort of let them know like that there's benefits for everybody of having a free press.
Yeah. Now I have an audience question here before we wrap up here. So they're wanting us to suggest some smaller Indigenous media outlets that we might not know about. And I know a couple were named already, like Media Indigena. We have One Dish, One Mic. What else? That are
Eastern Door, Element
Which
FM, Eastern Door.
Eastern Door, yes. Yeah.
There's Element FM radio in Ottawa and Toronto. Wind Speaker and ASMA. What is the acronym? AMSA. Thank you.
Alberta Multimedia Society. There's Alberta Native News.
Nunatsiaq News for all your Inuits reporting. They're not Indigenous, but they do hire Indigenous people. They're not Indigenous owned though.
Check out Soda Light, Jackie Hall-Thompson. Jackie Hall-Thompson is a reporter out of Akwesasne, who had worked with Steve Bonaspiel at the Eastern Door, which was already mentioned. That's a lot. Like many Indigenous communities have their own publications, like the Eastern Door and like Soda Light in Akwesasne, and so checking out in the individual communities, I think, is a good way to go.
And a shout out also to JHR for all the work that it does.
Yes, Journalists for Human Rights. I have actually one more question before we wrap up. Why do you think we're seeing such a rise in journalists being arrested in Canada, not only Indigenous journalists, but journalists in general? And they all seem to be covering contentious Indigenous stories. Why are we seeing such a rise in the last decade of this becoming more common, and that we have to be prepared for it, on a day-to-day basis?
You know, I kind of have this theory that, and I don't think it's as tinfoil hat as it sounds. Listen, as journalists, we all get together once or twice a year and we talk about issues that we're facing and how we're going to handle them. I think that probably police forces have gotten together and felt embarrassed, or maybe they didn't like media coverage, and they've been trying to look for some PR way to control it. I think that's really what the exclusion zones are about. I don't believe for 1 second. I mean, why would you have to be kept 12 kilometers away from a site for your safety as a reporter? You're going to bomb it? And you know, I say that laughing, but they bombed Gustavson Lake, right? Like they used detonation there. So I mean, it's got to be a PR thing where they're trying to keep reporters away. And I know, and I think it's also some hot-headed police officers as well on the force who don't understand the law. When APTN has had its camera seized, it was sort of an individual issue more than it was a force issue. The minute the police chief found out about it, the camera was returned. I think Jesse Winter, when he was facing off against the police force that looks after CN Rail, one of them told him, "I would love to be the cop that arrests a journalist." That's an individual hothead. Then you've got the systemic problem of why the police are called in the first place that we referred to before. This is probably not what police want to be doing. So it's probably not a great feeling for them to see themselves on the news at night, arresting women and children who are protecting land.
And do you think we're seeing more land defense? Is that another in the past 10 years than before?
I think that this situation is a product of, and that, I mean, at the heart of what I hope people are getting from the reporting that One Ditch One Mic is doing, the fact that there is a conflict again in between Caledonia and Haudenosaunee people, I think is a product of all of the systemic mechanisms breaking down in between. Like, we've had decades where this is this level of conflict, and honestly, we've had a century of things that could have happened. So I actually feel, even though they arrested me and I'm still frustrated about that, I actually feel sorry for the police, because they themselves went into the court of law. Charles Diana, the officer for the OPP, went into the court of law and said the term that Karyn used earlier, we're a blunt force mechanism. And there really should be something else that should be happening here, but there isn't. Indigenous people don't want their lands to be extracted from, and Canada really wants to make a lot of money off of Indigenous lands. And so as long as you got those things in conflict and not dealing with the underlying issue, then the police and land defenders and all kinds of other people are sucked into this big vortex of this fundamental disagreement.
Wow. Well, thank you. It was a good talk. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Journalists for Human Rights, and hopefully see you again, but not in this context. Hopefully,
hopefully we'll be celebrating Karl's freedom. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Nagitwa. Sunday mornings, 10 a.m.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you.